Endocrine part 2, very exciting. Before we get into part 2 of endocrine, any questions on part 1? Things that we are starting with. So just off the top of my head, the major things that we were looking at for part 1 last time was, again, looking at those chemical classes of hormones, how hormones work, what they are, the 2 chemical classes, how they are transferred in the blood, what they're made from, where the receptors are located, examples of water-soluble, lipid-soluble hormones, things like that, right? So that was a big topic. And it's a short answer question, possibility. As I was kind of letting you know, I updated the exam objectives and streamlined those, so I can tell you that's on there for sure. And then we also hit one of the largest endocrine organs, which is kind of what we're doing right now. We're right in the middle of it, the pituitary gland. And we discussed how it has a unique structure to it with an anterior and a posterior, 2 parts to it. And both of those parts are connected in some way to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls both the anterior and the posterior pituitary. On the anterior part, which is more glandular, the hypothalamus puts out hormones of its own to tell the anterior pituitary when to release and when to stop releasing hormones. So it's got hormonal control of the anterior pituitary. It's got neural control to a certain extent of the posterior pituitary. Because the posterior pituitary, which we're coming up to, we have neurons that start in the hypothalamus, where their soma or cell body is in the hypothalamus, and then the axons extend down into the posterior pituitary, and those axons actually release the 2 hormones that we're going to talk about for posterior pituitary. So that's a neural type of control for posterior pituitary, okay? So that was a kind of bigger topic too. The pituitary is a bigger topic because it releases so many hormones and because it exemplifies 2 different types of hormonal control, which was another topic that we got into. We said there was hormonal control of hormone release, neural control, and what was the third one? It also started with an H. Humoral control, where we are sampling and testing the humors, the fluids of the body, in order to know when we need to release hormones or not. Okay, so we had just finished, I think, with thyroid-stimulating hormone. Is that right? Okay, so this is one of our tropic hormones that is basically going down to other endocrine glands and telling them when to release their hormones, right? So hormonal control as well. So thyroid-stimulating hormone is telling those follicular cells to release thyroid hormone. So thyroid-stimulating hormone tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. So that's pretty straightforward. And when we were talking about metabolic rate being stimulated, that's an effect of T3 and T4, which are the chemical variants of thyroid hormone. That increases metabolism. But TSH causes the increase of thyroid hormone, which then causes the increase in metabolism. So it's kind of a cascading effect, right? But the direct effect of thyroid-stimulating hormone is to get the thyroid gland and those follicular cells to release T3 and T4. That's what it does. Okay? Okay, so from there, we have follicle-stimulating hormone. So follicle-stimulating hormone gets its common name from its job in the ovaries. This is another tropic hormone. It's going down to the ovaries, which is another kind of endocrine gland, right? Because we know we have hormones coming from there as well. But follicle-stimulating hormone goes down to the gonads and stimulates them to develop the gametes, right? So we have gametes, we have sex cells, whether they be eggs or sperm, that need to go through some maturation. They need to go through some changes in order to be viable for fertilization. And so in the ovaries, remember we have the oocyte that is surrounded by some cells that are called follicular cells. And together, follicular cells plus the egg or oocyte gives us a follicle. And so this hormone stimulates the formation of and development of follicles within the ovary to get them to go from primordial to primary to secondary to mature, like we saw in lab. Okay? So that's the main job. Now, as we were seeing in the morning lab today, the follicle, as it gets bigger, when it graduates to like a secondary follicle with that fluid-filled antrum, we saw that there are follicular cells along the edge of the follicle, granulosa cells and theca cells. Morning lab people are like, yeah, we did. Later lab people are like, I don't even know what that is. Really? We have to know that? Yep, you got to know that. In any case, those cells that are on the edge of a secondary and a mature follicle, particularly those theca cells, the flattened ones along the edge, they are the cells that put out estrogen. So as these follicles are stimulated to mature and get bigger, estrogen levels are going to increase. And we'll talk about the importance of that in terms of cycles coming up. Okay? So that's what we see, is that the follicles develop and those follicles, mature ones, etc., will secrete estrogen. So those are the functions in the female. In the male, we still have a follicle-stimulating hormone going down and telling the testes to produce sperm. As we saw in the lab, later lab people are like, come on, I want to see it. We saw inside of the testes these seminiferous tubules, and in the walls of the seminiferous tubules there are sperm that are developing through different stages. This is the hormone that tells the seminiferous tubules, yep, let's keep cranking out new sperm cells, from spermatogonia to spermatocyte to the mature sperm cells that we can release. So this is controlling, in essence, follicle-stimulating hormone is controlling more of the reproductive function, if you want to consider it that, of the gonads, for them to produce and mature gametes. Okay, whether it's male or whether it's female. The name kind of focuses on the female function of it, but it's the same whether it's male or female. Okay? So pretty straightforward with that one. We like those ones, which are kind of explanatory in terms of their name. Luteinizing hormone. Okay, so we have a picture of ovaries and testes again. So we're getting the idea it's another tropic hormone that goes down and tells the testes and the ovaries to do something. But on this level, this is more focused on the endocrine or the hormonal function of the gonads instead. We know that the ovaries put out progesterone as well as estrogen. Meanwhile, the testes put out testosterone. And so this hormone goes down and tells those organs effectively to put out more of their sex hormones. Now the name comes from, again, more related to its function in females. So luteinizing hormone, you may remember in the ovary we have this structure that's called the corpus luteum. So the corpus luteum forms after the egg is ovulated, right? We have all these follicular cells in a mature follicle at the edge. The egg gets ovulated, gets shot out of the ovary, gets caught by the fimbriae, right? And then we have the corpus hemorrhagicum left over, right? That turns into, it fills in and turns into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum, its main job is to secrete progesterone in order to let the uterus know, hey, you've got an egg on the way. I just shot it out of here, and so I'm giving you the message that it's on the way, and you better get prepared. You better build up that endometrium again, really start filling it with nutrients and blood supply and stuff like that, because you've got a guest that's on the way. So start preparing the guest room. Okay? What?
What does it release?
It releases progesterone mainly. So that progesterone is the message that's going to the uterus to tell it that the egg is on the way. Now it does release some estrogen as well. Okay? So we see this hormonal function kind of focus, if you will, for this luteinizing hormone. So it causes the formation of the corpus luteum because a big spike in luteinizing hormone, and we'll talk about this in reproductive system, is what causes ovulation. It's what causes the egg to be shot out of the ovary on that one day of the cycle, the ovarian cycle that we call ovulation. So there's 3 phases to the ovarian cycle that we'll talk about as well. That's the middle phase. Boop, the egg pops out. Okay? This is what causes it. Causes the egg to shoot, if you will, out, to be shot out, and then it also causes the formation of the corpus luteum, and our progesterone levels go up accordingly. Okay, so that is kind of its function in the females. In the males, then, luteinizing hormone tells the testes to produce testosterone. So again, we're seeing this endocrine function. We're telling the gonads to do whatever they need to do to produce those sex hormones. Now, in the males, in the testes, morning lab people saw that there were these interstitial cells in between the seminiferous tubules. Don't worry, later lab people, you'll see it soon. Those interstitial cells are the ones that produce testosterone. So this hormone goes down to those interstitial cells and stimulates them, tells them it's time to release more testosterone. Okay? So both follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone have a target organ of the gonads, but they have slightly different functions. One's more in terms of developing our sex cells. The other one's more focused on the endocrine function, getting those ovaries and our testes to release their sex hormones, which also have other effects that we'll talk about. Okay? Okay, so that's luteinizing hormone. Prolactin. So that one tends to be fairly easy. It's right in the name, right? It basically means go milk. Right? So it's stimulating the mammary tissue to produce milk. So this one is going to mainly have a function then in females. So in males, prolactin doesn't really have a function. So prolactin, mainly in females, but also coming from the anterior pituitary, going down to the gland. So in this case, with the mammary gland, since it's not another endocrine gland, we wouldn't say this is a tropic hormone. We have lots of other tropic hormones, like thyroid-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, stuff like that. But this one stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. So when we look at these cycles, you can imagine that cycles of hormone secretion is going to, those cycles are going to vary, right? So it could be there's a surge of a release of a hormone, like we talked about, like epinephrine in a stressful situation. All of a sudden, boom, we had a big bloom of epinephrine, right? So that's kind of episodic. We've got daily changes in hormone levels, maybe associated with different activity patterns and things like that, waking up, sleep-wake cycles, stuff like that. We have monthly cycles that are going to increase and decrease, estrogen, progesterone, things like that. And then you have almost like seasonal or even lifetime changes in hormone secretion. So for instance, testosterone, well, that one is going to greatly increase when the males sexually mature, not emotionally per se, but sexually mature. You're going to see a big spike in testosterone that then stays high for the rest of their lives, for the most part, right? So you're talking like a 50-year cycle or something like that of increased secretion versus decrease. And then, of course, with this one, you're not going to get a lot of prolactin coming out unless you're pregnant. And towards the end of the pregnancy, and preparing to support the baby in new ways, right? Okay. This is another tropic hormone. This one is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this one goes down to the adrenal gland and tells the cortex to release its hormone. So this one is a tropic hormone, and it tells it to release hormones like cortisol. So in fact, this should be tropic, and I do this like every semester, and I don't change it. I don't know why. So adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it goes down to the adrenal glands, the cortex of the adrenal glands, and tells it to release its hormone. So glucocorticoids, we'll find that the adrenal glands put out kind of groups of hormones, and then there's one that's well known of it, okay? So it's kind of like the Kardashians, no. But glucocorticoids affect glucose levels. So stressful situations, you got to have glucose available because your body is going to need to use that glucose in an emergency, not necessarily an emergency, but a more stressful situation. So cortisol or cortisone is the main stress hormone, and so that's the main one of a glucocorticoid. So this is the way that the pituitary gland, anterior pituitary, tells the adrenal cortex when it's time to release that stress hormone. Okay? So again, nice straightforward functions and pretty straightforward names as well. Now this one, this is our seventh one. This one's weird, and so it's not very critical for our purposes, just because melanocyte-stimulating hormone, if we look at the term melanocyte, so melanin is a pigment, right? Cyte cell. So these are pigment-producing cells that are found in the skin of some organisms like frogs, and they can change color and things like that. That doesn't happen with us. And so melanocyte-stimulating hormone, they really don't know what it does in humans. They think it may have to do with fat metabolism or something like that. They're starting to look at that, but they really don't know. So again, open areas of research. So as you guys are going into your careers, maybe you guys could figure that out. Let me know, and then I can update the slide. Yeah.
So, but melanocyte, that's like skin pigmentation, but, so we know it has to do with skin pigmentation, but just not much else?
Right, so it has to do with changes in skin pigmentation in other vertebrates as opposed to humans. So on the one level, for us, we're like, okay, we have cells that produce pigments, and we know that they can change the amount of pigment that they release. Think about sun tanning, right? When we're doing that protective screening, etc. But it's not related to that for whatever reason, right? So we don't see a boom in melanocyte-stimulating hormone during the summer.
Okay.
So you would hope that would be the case. It'd be a much clearer story, but not. So again, with this one, you could use it as an example of, again, a pituitary hormone, but I wouldn't really worry about it. There's lots of other ones that are more relevant for humans. All right, so all of those were from the anterior pituitary, also called the adenohypophysis. A lot of stuff going on in the adenohypophysis, right? Mostly tropic hormones stimulating other endocrine glands, and a few others like growth hormone and prolactin. All right, posterior pituitary, remember this is out of the inferior surface of the brain. So in terms of controlling the posterior pituitary, we're looking at that neural control where we have a couple different populations of neurons. Again, you can see those somae or cell bodies up there, axons coming down through the infundibulum and releasing hormones into the bloodstream from there. So these two hormones here come from the posterior pituitary, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. They're released from the posterior pituitary, but they're made up in the hypothalamus, right? So it's a kind of a weird situation. All of our other endocrine glands make their own hormones and release their own hormones. This one's a little bit different. So only two hormones. That makes it a little bit easier. And again, like the anterior and with the hypothalamus, don't worry about specific cells. I have them listed there, somatotrophs and various things like that, lactotrophs. Don't worry about the specific cells. As long as you know whether it comes from the anterior pituitary, the posterior pituitary, that's the most important thing, okay? Okay, so oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. These are both, it says they are made up of 9 amino acids. So these are fairly short. We're talking like peptides, etc., right? If you had to guess, in all of your anatomical and physiological knowledge, would these be water-soluble or lipid-soluble, made out of amino acids? You got a 50-50 shot. Water-soluble, right? Water-soluble, got to be made of amines, proteins, peptides, amino acids, right? Lipid-soluble is going to be made from cholesterol mainly for our steroid hormones. Then we have those weird thyroids, right? T3 and T4, which are also lipid-soluble. Good. All right, so these could be examples if you were answering a question about water-soluble hormones, like what they're made from and how they're transported in the blood and where the receptors are, et cetera, et cetera. These are a couple examples that you could use in saying, and this is a water-soluble hormone, oxytocin or antidiuretic hormone. Now, luckily for us, one of those we already know a lot about. So antidiuretic hormone we've talked about already. We know the details about that in terms of aquaporins and the collecting tubules and the kidneys and the nephrons associated with the nephrons anyway. Oxytocin, we've talked about this one a little bit. This one has to do with stimulating the smooth muscle in the myometrium of our uterus. So oxytocin is going to be highly involved in terms of labor and contractions as it's stimulating the uterine muscle to contract. This is getting the baby to be ejected, if you will, but also after the baby is ejected, quote unquote, there's the afterbirth. There's the placenta, that whole organ that has been developed through time to support the baby to allow this interface between the maternal circulation and the fetal circulation. That also, we don't need that anymore. So that has to be ejected as well. So muscular contractions are helping to separate that from the wall, eject that. And then muscular contractions kind of continue to try to get that uterus back towards an original size as opposed to how big it's been to accommodate an individual for 9 months, right? So a lot of smooth muscle contractions that are under the control of oxytocin. One of the other interesting things about oxytocin is that it's our primary example of positive feedback, right? We have 2 examples in the body of positive feedback loops as opposed to negative feedback loops, where it increases and increases and increases the response. So when more oxytocin is released, we have more contractions of the uterus, which sets off more mechanoreceptors feeding back to the hypothalamus saying, oh, we're contracting more. How about some more oxytocin? Let's contract even more, right? More intensely, more frequency. And it builds and builds and builds until the baby is birthed. So again, we're switching from a set point where we have two individuals, and we're now moving the set point to a new, or kind of once again, maintaining one individual, maintaining the mother's body as opposed to maintaining two bodies for 9 months, right? So we're switching the set point. That's why we have positive feedback there. We're pushing it away from that set point. There's also some information about oxytocin and how it has an effect on the brain as well. So they think that it has something to do with emotional pair bonding between individuals, adult individuals, as well as between adult individuals and the baby. Because it's a key thing when you're having offspring that not only did you take care of them internally, but when they're in that vulnerable phase outside of your body now, they still need care. And you need to care about their care. And so there is, I think, a feedback mechanism with oxytocin that does an emotional bonding between you and that other new individual that you made, so that you care about when they are crying, when they have particular physiological needs, etc. Right? So they've done research on that. They've done research in rats, right? Their typical kind of mammalian analog, where they modified the oxytocin levels in female rats, and then they looked at that type of kind of offspring care and maternal care. And what they found is, on normal levels, they would do their typical thing, right? They would kind of feed them, they would take care of them, clean them, create nests for them, and things like that. With artificially lowered level oxytocin levels, couldn't care less. Walk over them, stuff like that, not feed them, etc. So as we were talking about some of us in lab, I don't know if they've made that link yet, but it seems like there would be a link there with maybe postpartum depression, right? Because part of that is, gosh, I don't know if I can handle all this right now. I'm just overwhelmed, etc. Maybe that's a hormonal thing, right? We know there's lots of effects, emotional effects of hormones, as well as other physiological effects. So maybe that comes into play there, right? Besides that, there's also other interesting things. Do I still have that in there? Maybe. They got to get rid of some of that research. This was the article that actually went through that research. But another interesting thing that you can find is now they capitalize that. So what they found is that it involves trust, right? So emotional trust is where you have some sort of confidence in another individual that they're taking care of you, you're taking care of them. That's trust, right? So they're like, oh, that's associated with oxytocin. So if we can make some of that synthetic and put it in a bottle, oh, look at that. Liquid trust. So you put that in a bottle and then you kind of spray that on yourself, and then all of a sudden people are trusting you. Now, obviously, trust is more than that. There's a whole experience with it, right? In terms of how much your relationship, how well you know that person, and how they've treated you through time, etc. But there is an effect of oxytocin as well. And one of the interesting aspects of research that had to do with this, where they discovered that, is that they did an experiment at a university, right, a research university, and they had human subjects, probably college students that want an extra credit. They'll do a lot for extra credit, right? And so they took the experience of these college students, and they, in essence, put them in this situation where they had a person who was acting as if they were their financial advisor. So they would come into the room and they say, okay, so we're going to give you whatever, $10,000 in play money. At the beginning of this, you're going to talk to a financial advisor, and based on your experience with them, how much of your $10,000 are you willing to invest with them, and how much are you going to hold on to, right? Effectively, how much do you trust that they are having your best interest in mind, and they know what you're doing and stuff like that? So they had people separated into two groups. Both of those groups, prior to going in with a financial advisor, they got a little in their nose. One of them was just saline, salt water. The other one, oxytocin in it. Then they sent them in. That was the only difference. Sent them in to a financial advisor, spent time with them. Okay, how much at the end of it, how much money are you willing to give to your financial advisor? Those in the oxytocin treatment group, much more money given to the advisor compared to those that didn't. So, in any case, like we said, there's a lot of things that go into trust, not just like, oh, love potion number 9 or something like that. But at the same time, you know, people are capitalizing on it. What, are you going into a sales office? Oh, how about that? I like this person. Going to the bar? Oh, right?
So what you're saying is don't go shopping when you're pregnant? Or don't get sold anything when you're pregnant because your oxytocin's higher?
Oxytocin might be higher, or like shortly thereafter, right? When you're taking care of babies and you're like, just give me that. That's going to be good for me, right? I'll buy that, right? There's other types of hormones and other things going on at that time as well, right? Cortisol levels are up and estrogen levels are up and things like that.
No, I don't drink anymore, but I still shop like I do, like when I'm tired. All of a sudden it'll show up, I'm like, wait, when did I have my leggings? But it's when I'm like 36 hours mostly. Like,
Yeah. So there's lots of things that go into the physiology that can certainly affect our situation in terms of decisions, etc. Okay. So in any case, main role of oxytocin, stimulate the smooth muscle in the uterus, in the myometrium to contract. Okay? Okay, so this just goes through that positive feedback cycle like we were talking about in terms of how increases in the stretching occurring in the wall of the uterus can lead to increases in oxytocin, which then causes those contractions that then leads to more oxytocin being released. Okay, the other one from the posterior pituitary, we already talked about that. That is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, the other name for it is vasopressin. Vaso means vessel. Yeah, so vessel, pressin, pressure. So blood pressure. This one is working to maintain or increase blood pressure. We can do that by holding on to water in the kidneys, as we learned before. But this also works as a vasoconstrictor. If we have low blood volume and low blood pressure, by vasoconstricting, as well as increasing heart rate, maybe decreasing sweating, conserving our fluids, we're going to look to maintain blood volume and blood pressure as much as we can, right? So not only are the kidneys going to be a target organ there, but there are a few other organs that can be target organs for antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin. But we mainly know about that one already. Okay. So, has to do with fluid levels, and if we are dehydrated, then antidiuretic hormone is going to be released, as opposed to when we have higher fluid levels, we don't need to worry about conserving quite as much. Okay. 2 hormones from the posterior pituitary, 6, maybe 7 if you want to consider melanocyte-stimulating hormone, coming from the anterior pituitary. Lots going on in the pituitary gland. So now we're going to move our way inferior. We're going to go from the pituitary, attach to the brain. We're going to work our way down, go to the neck. So in this case, we get to the thyroid gland. Now on the anterior side of the thyroid gland, we have this butterfly-shaped organ that we see here, inferior to the thyroid cartilage. That's the thyroid gland. If we have a chance to look at the torso model again, we did do a neck dissection of the torso, not torso model, the cadaver. Torso model is a model of the cadaver. You can actually see the thyroid gland in the cadaver, which is pretty interesting, as well as some of the blood vessels and things like that going to and from it. In any case, thyroid gland, butterfly-shaped gland that we see there, that produces 2 different hormones. One of them is a thyroid hormone, comes in 2 chemical variants, T3 and T4, come from the follicular cells, as opposed to the parafollicular cells that occur between those follicles, which is putting out calcitonin. So 2 different main category of hormones coming from 2 different cells. Follicular cells putting out thyroid hormone, so T3 and T4 basically are also known as thyroid hormone. And then our parafollicular cells are putting out calcitonin, which has a totally different function. We know calcitonin, as the name indicates, helps us to regulate calcium levels in the body. Whereas thyroid hormone regulates our metabolism, the series of life-sustaining chemical reactions that are occurring in cells. How fast we're processing energy in those cells using those chemical reactions is what thyroid hormone is doing. So thyroid hormone, like we said, is made in our follicular cells, follicular cells along the edge of the follicle, like we see here. And they do a lot of the manufacturing inside of the cell, but they use that pinkish colloid on the inside to help with that manufacturing. And that's what we're seeing down below there. So what you can see is, with the blood supply, they're getting their different components in order to synthesize their thyroid hormone. Remember, thyroid hormone T3 and T4? It's our other example of a lipid-soluble hormone. Okay? So what we can see here is that we're synthesizing this hormone inside of the cells lining, inside of the follicular cells. Notice that we are pulling iodide from the blood. So we're pulling this essential item from the blood that comes to us in our diet. Iodide is a critical component of T3 and T4, or thyroid hormone. So we're going to do some iodination of tyrosine. So tyrosine, when we're talking about this, that's one of the main components that we see here. It's one of the main components of this hormone. And iodide is the other component. So when you look at your diet, anybody know where iodide comes from? Salt, right? So when you look at salt and you go to the grocery store and you're looking at a canister of salt, most of your salts, not your gourmet salts, most of your salts will say that they're iodide. So iodide is added to the salt to make sure everybody is getting enough iodide in their diet to supply the thyroid gland. That's the main reason it's in the salt. Everybody eats salt. We know that you're going to get this critical iodide in your diet so you can make thyroid hormone. Okay? There are, right, if you become iodide deficient, now the thyroid gland can't make functional thyroid hormone. It can try, right, but it doesn't have all the components. So it's kind of like how you can become anemic, where you're making red blood cells, but you don't have enough components to make hemoglobin. You don't have enough amino acids to be knitting together that protein, so you don't have enough functional hemoglobin. Kind of like that, right? So if you don't have enough iodide in your diet, then the thyroid gland will do what it can to make thyroid hormone, and if it gets overstimulated by, thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, it can actually bulk up because it's being demanded. We're demanding that we're making that much more thyroid hormone, but it can't. So it does its best to increase its size in order to increase output, but without that iodide, it really can't. And in fact, an increase, if you have a massive, your thyroid gland can become very enlarged in that instance, and that's what is called a goiter. So if you haven't, you can Google that. Goiter, you can just looks like they have a tumor right here in their neck, and so that is when our thyroid gland is overstimulated like that. Okay.
Do you happen to know, because thyroid nodules are like blood vessel related to the vascular system, but goiters aren't? Or do you know about that topic?
Yeah, so that's a good question. My guess is, so a thyroid, for whatever reason, the thyroid gland has been a problematic organ of our endocrine. So of our different endocrine glands, it seems like, each one can have problems, like we talked about, gigantism and dwarfism and stuff like that. And with the pancreas, we can have problems with pancreatic islets and insulin, and et cetera. But for whatever reason, thyroid glands seem to have a lot of issues, more so in women than in men. And so that's why they're always constantly asking you to check thyroid levels, check T3 and T4 levels, check TSH levels, and then also palpating it, looking at the size of it, looking for nodules. My guess is that the nodules, right, hardened areas of this tissue is where it is, becoming more like kind of tumor related, if you will, where we have maybe growth of cells that are not really functional. So usually benign, but can become cancerous. So I think it's more that level as opposed to when we're talking about a goiter, the whole thing, even the functional cells, we're just making more cells to try to meet the demand. So much like when we talk about muscles getting bigger because we're increasing the demand on the muscles, and so they're like, I guess we're doing this, we better hypertrophy in order to meet the need. Same thing in terms of the thyroid gland. So the cells are functional, but their product that they're putting out for whatever reason is not. It can be an immune issue where immune system is attacking those hormones and pulling them out of circulation, or like you said, you're not making enough appropriately formed thyroid hormone, and so you're not getting the response that they bump in metabolism you're supposed to, and so the hypothalamus which is kind of looking at this and sensing it, is saying, hey, I told you to increase metabolism. You're not doing your job, so I'm going to keep stimulating you until you do. And so then it just kind of increases like that.
Because the hypothalamus can't tell what the problem is, so it
Right.
just tells the cells to do more.
Yeah, because it's that whole trickle-down effect. So hypothalamus tells anterior pituitary, release more thyroid-stimulating hormone. Now this gland tries to meet that demand, but it functionally can't. So we don't see the cells then increasing their metabolism because they're not getting that message. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the whole T3 and T4 thing, and the whole follicles with the colloid in the center, it's a manufacturing process. So it starts in the cells, in the follicular cells, using the iodide and the tyrosine and stuff like that. And then you can see it's kind of assembled in the colloid. And then we bring it back in a lysosome, and we release it from the cell, from the follicular cells into the blood. So it's just part of the manufacturing process as to why we have those follicles. And T3 and T4 are made, they're two different variants of thyroid hormone. We take these little building blocks called T1 and T2, and if you knit them together, you get, T3. T1 plus T2 gives T3. T2 plus T2, there's T4. Don't ask me why there's not a T2, like T1 plus T1 gives us T2, I don't know. Maybe that's how we already had T2 like we were talking about out here, but functionally, that's how we get our two different chemical forms of thyroid hormone, okay? And that assembly is occurring there in the colloid. Colloid is a lipid-based material, and this is, if you remember, a lipid-soluble hormone. So that's what's going on out there in the colloid in those follicles. Okay, so thyroid. The thyroid hormone, T3 and T4, so that is effectively thyroid hormone, okay, is responsible for increasing metabolic rate. So metabolic rate, that means tons of different cells in the body are going to respond to this that have receptors, right? They're going to increase their metabolic reactions in terms of glucose, using glucose and things like that. So it increases those reactions. It causes the synthesis of protein in some cells to break down to fat so we can have more energetic molecules available. And we're going to be using that glucose more to make ATP inside of mitochondria, etc. So increasing the cellular activity in many different types of tissues and cells. So lots of different targets, kind of like growth hormone. And in fact, those two work together very regularly. Growth hormone also, in addition to growing things like bones and muscles, increases metabolic rate, right? Increases use of energy, etc., chemical energy. Okay, flip to the other side. We have the parafollicular cells that release calcitonin. So calcitonin from the parafollicular cells on the outside, that is going to work to help modify calcium levels. But notice it lowers blood calcium levels, okay? With any of these hormones, we have to say what it does. Not just it has an effect on, that's too generic. Like, for instance, in thyroid hormone, we say it increases the metabolic rate. Don't just say has an effect on, right? Because that, does it increase, does it decrease? So in this case, it lowers blood calcium. What that means is we're going to take some of that calcium that we've absorbed from our diet, we're going to knit it into the bone. So our osteoblasts are going to do their job of creating bone tissue. Osteoclasts that are chewing up bone, we're going to say, hey, why don't you guys take a break? Take 5. Let us knit some of that calcium in for a while and stop chewing it up, okay? In the small intestine, we can let some of that calcium go. We're not going to absorb it. We're going to get rid of calcium in the kidneys. So lots of different organs that contribute to calcium homeostasis. But the main role of this one is we've got a lot of calcium here. We just ate a whole fromage cheese meal. We were just at melting pot and we had just cheese all over the place. So calcium levels are through the roof. We need to tamp those down. That's what calcitonin is going to do. And in fact, calcitonin is really only for these instances when we have a big calcium spike for whatever reason. On most days, the other antagonistic hormone to calcitonin is actually going to handle our calcium levels. So associated with the thyroid gland, we have parathyroid glands, right? So on the backside of the thyroid, we have these 4 parathyroid glands. Notice we're looking at the backside, right? So these parathyroid glands are attached to the thyroid, and these put out parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone also helps to regulate calcium levels, but what they're doing is they are working to increase blood calcium instead, right? Antagonistic effects. Increase blood calcium. So on a day-to-day basis, when your calcium levels are getting a little bit low, we release parathyroid hormone. It tells the osteoclast to chew up a little bit of that bony matrix and release calcium into the blood. Tells the intestines, oh, let's pull a little bit extra from the food. Tells the kidneys to spare it and hold on to it instead. Okay, reabsorb it. So this has the antagonistic effect. So if it gets a little bit low, parathyroid says, hey, pull it from reserves, absorb it a little bit more, and we'll bring it up. And then when it gets into the normal range, we just let that go a little bit. And then parathyroid brings it up a little bit. So it varies within homeostatic levels for the most part, just under parathyroid hormones control. And it's only, like we said, when we have a fat cheese meal that maybe we need this extra break on calcium for calcitonin to tamp it back down. Okay? So they are antagonistic. They do have opposite effects. Parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland, that's nice and easy. Calcitonin from the thyroid gland, from those parafollicular cells. Antagonistic effects, but for the most part, parathyroid hormone handles it calcium on a day-to-day basis. Okay? We love parathyroid gland because it puts out one hormone, has a very simple name, has one job to do. Okay, so this is just going through some of those feedback mechanisms in terms of seeing calcium levels drop down and then being able to raise them up again. Parathyroid, bless you, also has an effect on calcitriol, which when we talk about like vitamin D and stuff like that, it is integrated in that way as well, because we know vitamin D and calcium are related. So that's part of the whole cycle in terms of activities of parathyroid hormone. All right, so we've done thyroid and then parathyroid glands that are on the back side of it. And now we're moving inferiorly again. We're going down to the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands, or the suprarenal glands, sit on top of the kidneys, as we've seen on our models. We've seen in the microscope that there are two regions to the adrenal glands. There is a cortex and a medulla, right? So the cortex is all of this out here, and the medulla is all of this in the inside instead. Now that's what we saw in the microscope. We needed to know cortex and medulla. We knew that those two regions of the adrenal glands put out different hormones, right? Different regions, different hormones, just like the pituitary. So all of a sudden now we're like, oh, okay, adrenal glands getting a little complex like the pituitary. So that means, in terms of the test and whatever, probably more questions having to do with adrenal gland compared to something easy like parathyroid gland or something like that, right? All right, so we got two regions to it. Now what we discover is that in the cortex there are 1, 2, 3 different zones to the cortex, okay? So these are the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis, GFR. So GFR, luckily, we just came out of urinary system where we had that acronym GFR that was telling us glomerular filtration rate, but at least we're kind of familiar with GFR as an acronym, and now that can help to remind us that glomerulosa is the most superficial, then fasciculata, then reticularis of the cortex, okay? Each one of those zones, guess what? Puts out a different hormone. All right, so we've got to tag what hormones come from the cortex, what hormones come from the medulla, and which ones come from which zones in the cortex as well. And in fact, you can see, there's our layout of the hormones, okay? Aldosterone coming out of the glomerulosa, cortisol mainly coming out of the fasciculata, androgens, we'll talk about that, coming out of the reticularis, and there's our epinephrine and norepinephrine coming out of the adrenal medulla. So there's a nice lineup of these different hormones with the regions that they come from. But now we have to understand, okay, what do these different hormones do? And one of the things that we'll find is that these hormones that we're mentioning here, the names, they are a specific, kind of like the whole T3 and T4 thing with thyroid hormone. Those are specific kind of chemical variants of these categories of hormones that come out of these different zones. So for instance, aldosterone is the main mineral corticoid. Comes from the cortex and helps to regulate minerals, right? We talk about vitamins and minerals, right? When you're eating your Fruit Loops in the morning and stuff like that. Mineral aspect of it are generally talking about things like electrolytes, right? Like magnesium and calcium and sodium and stuff like that, right? And what do we know that aldosterone does? What does it regulate? Sodium, right? So we talked about how it increases sodium and technically chloride reabsorption in the kidneys and how water will tend to follow it. And because it's a sodium-potassium pump or a sodium-hydrogen pump, it also produces the excretion, although more correctly secretion, right? Tubular secretion of potassium and hydrogen ions. So this isn't anything new. We already know about aldosterone, helps us to regulate sodium. But it comes from the adrenal cortex. More specifically, it comes from the zona glomerulosa, the first one, the G of the GFR. So they're called mineralocorticoids. There are other chemical variants of aldosterone. They're slightly different. But effectively, aldosterone and mineralocorticoids are the same thing. Okay? Okay. So we know that in terms of aldosterone, it's actually hormonally controlled, right? Part of the RAS mechanism. If sodium levels are getting low, we need to hold on to it, or blood pressure is getting low or something like that. It's part of the RAS mechanism where we see that renin being released from the kidney, angiotensinogen from the liver getting activated, and then angiotensinogen 2 from the lungs. There's an enzyme that converts it to 2. That gets the release of our aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. It also helps to increase blood pressure by acting as a vasoconstrictor. So, as we saw before, antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone often work together. The mechanism is slightly different. Antidiuretic hormone, reabsorption of water. Aldosterone, reabsorption of sodium mainly, and then the water tends to follow indirectly. Okay, so homeostatic regulation of things. Now we move to the next layer. It's cortex still. So we're still in the cortex. Cortex. And now we've moved down to zona fasciculata instead. So now we move down to the F region. These are the glucocorticoids. The main glucocorticoid is cortisol or cortisone. Okay? So now we're seeing aldosterone. We're seeing corticosterone or cortisol, ending in ONE, like testosterone, like progesterone. These are steroid hormones. These are other examples of steroid hormones or lipid-soluble hormones. Okay? So cortisol is a stress hormone, especially as we're getting down towards the end of the semester. Your cortisol levels coming from your adrenal cortex and your zona fasciculata are increasing. So your adrenal glands are working harder now. And it helps to also regulate metabolism. So it's an energetic hormone, much like growth hormone, much like thyroid hormone. Cortisol is also working on kind of metabolic reactions. In this case, what we're doing is we don't know what's going on. We may not be able to promote growth and stuff like that. We can't grow the body right now. We are so stressed out. We need to break down stuff to make sure energy levels are high enough in case we need to run from a bear or in case we need to crank out a paper overnight that we've been putting off all semester or something like that, right? So a lot of catabolic reactions going on in response to cortisol. So we do breakdowns of things to free up these energetic molecules so that we can make more glucose in these stressful situations. Whether it's emotional stress, whether it's physical stress or whatever, cortisol levels will increase. And generally, we're making sure that these nutrients are available for ATP production so we can make more ATP, etc. Okay? So it does have to do with metabolism, but this has to do a little bit more in terms of freeing up glucose levels. It also works as a vasoconstrictor, right? When you're stressed, what's happening is your blood pressure is going up as well, and this is having an effect on that. Now here's the weird thing about our cortisol. So when you have some sort of inflammation, right? When you have inflammation, what's happening there? Your blood vessels are dilating, you're getting more blood flow to that area because there's damage, there's infection or something like that, right? So cortisol, we said, is a vasoconstrictor. Oh. So if we have cortisol or cortisone in some sort of a cream and we put it on something, it can work as a vasoconstrictor, right? It can work on decreasing capillary permeability as well as work as a vasoconstrictor, but it also can reduce some of those immune system effects that are producing inflammation. But this level, when we're talking about cortisol and cortisone levels being anti-inflammatory, which is almost the, kind of an extreme case of what it's supposed to be doing, this is like at medicinal levels, right? So there's not usually high enough cortisol levels where you're going to see these types of anti-inflammatory effects coming on. You can get up there. We do know that when we get stressed, when we're kind of eating away at our body because of stress, it also makes us more vulnerable to attack, right? We can't necessarily route those energetic resources towards immune system and being on patrol and stuff like that. So we tend to get sicker a little bit more when we're stressed. But this type of anti-inflammatory effect overall is where you have, when you see it's like a 0.5% cortisone cream or something like that you would put on something. Generally, those are the medicinal effects that we're talking about that are up and above our normal levels that we would have in the body. Also, you hear about what? Cortisone shots. Oh. So if you've got a joint and there's damage and there's a lot of inflammation there, one of the ways to get that inflammation to go away is a cortisone injection. And so that, for a period of time, then decreases the inflammation, decreases the pain, increases mobility, and stuff like that. But it's not a solution. Whatever's going on there, right? If it's an infection, if it's a degradation of the tissue or something like that, that problem's still going to be there. And that's why those cortisone shots don't last as well. As it gets broken down, as we kind of immobilize it or basically pull it out of the system, then it's going to go away. Okay. Glomerulosa fasciculata reticularis, the lowest, deepest level of our adrenal cortex, produces our androgens. Now, androgens, interestingly enough, we would consider these overall male sex hormones. So you're like, wait a second, wait, I thought I had this straight. We have testes that produce sperm cells as well as produce testosterone coming from the interstitial cells. And that is correct. And that's where the bulk, in males, that's where the bulk of our testosterone comes from. Okay, it comes from the testes. But these cells, deep in the adrenal cortex, also release kind of testosterone variants that we would call androgens, right? Androgyny and stuff like that, that refers to male. So androgens are these hormones that effectively produce male characteristics. So there's a small amount that's released from the adrenal cortex, from this deepest layer. Now in males, that small amount that is released here is overwhelmed by the hormones that are coming from the testes. So it's insignificant. But in females, where the sex hormones are progesterone and estrogen instead, this little bit of testosterone may contribute to things like sex drive, etc. in females, they think. So in that way, because it's such a small amount and we have no other source of it, it may have a larger effect in females than in males. So they're still looking into that. And in fact, with steroid hormones, remember how we said they're all based on cholesterol, and it's just basically what you attach to it, the functional groups as to whether it's aldosterone or progesterone or whatever. So they think also in postmenopausal females, those where the female reproductive cycles are now tapering off, the estrogen levels and progesterone levels are also tapering off, those gonads are kind of cycling down, at least the adrenal glands are still kicking, and so maybe some of these androgens that are put out, we might be able to convert those to estrogens instead to help maintain those levels. It doesn't take the place of, but that's what they think. Okay, so that's adrenal cortex, superficial layer of the adrenal gland. Kind of complex because we have 3 different zones, 3 different hormones or categories of hormones coming out there. Okay? And different control mechanisms as well, right? So for instance, cortisol, when we were talking about that, ACTH from the pituitary gland, remember, is going down and is affecting cortisol levels. That's the hormonal control that we see in terms of that axis. So ACTH from the anterior pituitary tells the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Now, aldosterone, that's part of the RAS mechanism. That's also hormonal control, but that's starting with the kidney, going through a bunch of different steps, and then ending up in the adrenal gland. So I highlight that because as we get to the adrenal medulla, the core of it, this is where we have this kind of neural origin tissue, which is really developed from postganglionic sympathetic neurons. And we know sympathetic nervous system is the part of our brain and spinal cord, if you will, where we have this autonomic or stress response, but it's neurotransmitters that are typically being released, epinephrine and norepinephrine, on different organs to increase their activity in a lot of cases. In this case, we have similar types of neurons. We have neural control. We have a preganglionic sympathetic neuron that goes all the way from the brain, goes down to the adrenal medulla, and goes bzz, bzz, bzz. We're in a stressful situation here. And so we need epinephrine to not only be released on organs, but just flood the system with it, wake up everything because we're under stress. So again, you can imagine cortisol probably goes up when this sympathetic response in the adrenal medulla is going up as well. But we produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's released into the bloodstream, so technically it counts not as a neurotransmitter, but as a hormone because it's dumped into the bloodstream. And this type of neural control of this release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream is happening during a sympathetic response. So we would kind of say that the response is it mimics the sympathetic nervous system. So the same types of things that we learned that the sympathetic nervous system responses would be in terms of decreasing our digestive response, increasing heart rate, doing vasoconstriction and stuff like that. All of these things associated with fight or flight behavior is going to be a similar response when we're releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine from the medulla. Okay? Okay. So, neural control of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla dumps that into the bloodstream, gets our sympathomimetic effects going on, our stress response. So that's the inside of the adrenal gland. Outside, cortex, inside, medulla. Different regions, different zones, releasing different hormones. But you can tell, like the pituitary gland, the adrenal gland is a bit more complex. So make sure when you're doing your flashcards, as I was recommending, you put the name of the hormone on the front, on the back, put where it comes from. And so you have to be as specific as possible. Does it come from the adrenal cortex or the medulla? If it comes from the cortex, is it coming from the zona glomerulosa, fasciculata, or reticularis, right? And then, also on the back of that flashcard, what does the hormone do? What are target organs, etc.? If it's really diffuse, like growth hormone, you don't have to put specific target organs. But if there is a very specific one, like we said, like antidiuretic hormone or something like that, make sure that it's put in there. So make sure that you have those functions attached to the hormones and where those hormones come from. All right. Pancreas, moving our way down. So pancreas, mainly digestive in function, as we discussed before, but also very important in terms of regulating glucose levels. Now again, we've been seeing glucose coming up in different hormones when we were talking about metabolism, where we were talking about, growth hormone and thyroid hormone and, even epinephrine and things like that. But the primary organs and primary spaces or areas of an organ that controls our glucose levels in the blood are going to be those pancreatic islets that we see in the microscope, where we have both insulin and glucagon being produced. Now, there are a few other, within those pancreatic islets, those little islands, if you will, the 1% of the pancreas. Within those islands, we have a bunch of different cells, and we know different cells can put out different hormones. There are different types of cells in there. There are like G cells in there as well. And then there are a variety of cells that are putting out different chemical messengers. The primary ones that we're going to focus on are going to be our beta cells putting out insulin and our alpha cells putting out glucagon. Okay? Somatostatin is a chemical messenger as well. Remember when we were talking about G cells in the stomach and we had gastrin that was affecting like the other cells in that area, right? Like a paracrine. Somatostatin is kind of like that too. Somatostatin is kind of like overarching and managing our alpha cells and our beta cells and telling them to increase and decrease their activity. So it is a chemical messenger, but we're going to kind of mainly focus on these two because those are the primary hormones that regulate glucose levels, blood glucose levels. They're antagonistic, okay? We need to know that insulin comes from the beta cells. Glucagon comes from the alpha cells instead. And in fact, glucagon has an A in it, and that symbol, right? That's our Greek symbol, alpha, basically is A, okay? So what we find is that those alpha cells that produce glucagon, that's about 20% of the cell population in our pancreatic islets, and what they work to do is increase blood glucose. So that means that we're freeing up, like calcium, that means that we have glucose floating in the blood available for cells that need it. So the question is, how do we kind of affect these free glucose levels? So alpha cells and glucagon are going to increase blood glucose. Beta cells, which produce insulin, are going to decrease blood glucose. So on a simple level, they have an antagonistic effect. Our free glucose is going to go up or down. I tend to think of insulin as causing glucose to be stored in cells of the body. So for instance, our skeletal muscle and our liver are our main target organs here. And when we need, if you have too much glucose floating around, like after Easter with all that candy, or if you come by my office hours, like after class today, I have a brain food jar on my desk that has free candy in it, which sounds kind of creepy, but it's not. I'm just saying it's like a social thing. We hang out, we eat, right? Point is, if we're eating candy together there, our glucose levels are going to spike. With all that glucose that comes in, the body goes, well, I don't need this right now, but I might need it later. So I need to store it inside of cells, not floating around. And so insulin tells the muscle cells and the liver cells primarily to take that glucose from the blood, knit it into a larger molecule called glycogen, and store it inside the cell for later on. It's kind of like how we can store fat, right, as well. So that's what insulin is doing. You're storing our glucose as glycogen inside of our cells. Meanwhile, glucagon has the opposite effect, right? So in that case, we're going to break down that glycogen, those glycogen stores, and we're going to release that free glucose into the bloodstream instead. So there's many more of those insulin-producing beta cells in our pancreatic islets that decrease blood glucose as opposed to the alpha cells. But they work with each other or against each other, if you want to consider it that way, to make sure that our glucose levels stay within a normal range, right? We don't want it to be much higher than about 100 or so, but it can. Okay, so like I said, there's a variety of other cells in there. There's the delta cells producing that somatostatin. There's F cells in there that put out what's called pancreatic polypeptide that communicates with the chief cells in the stomach. We can see how there's this relationship between our digestive organs. But our primary focus for us is going to be here and here. Okay? The other ones definitely occur in there. If you want to learn those, that's good, but we're trying to streamline things. Okay? Okay. This one, I'm not going to get into the details about this. I thought it was interesting. I went to a conference where it actually talked about how glucose stimulates insulin secretion, and it showed like there are little receptors, right? Because the point is here, see those little receptors that we see along here? Along the edge of cells? These beta cells inside of the pancreatic islets, how do they know when glucose levels are getting, in this case, too high, right? How do they know that? Who's controlling it? Do we have hormones coming down and in command of them? Do we have a neuron coming down? No. This is an example of our humoral control. We do a direct sampling from the fluids around the cells to say, how are those glucose levels out there? Are they okay? Are they getting too high? Do we need to tamp them down and store that glucose inside of cells, inside of the skeletal muscle and stuff like that? So they have receptors for glucose where they can sample it. And if it's getting too high, then we can release insulin, which is going to bring those blood glucose levels down. So you don't need to know any of that per se. But I thought it was interesting to actually see, look, there's the receptor that actually senses that glucose. And then there's a series of events, right, that lead to changes in membrane permeability. It opens up calcium channels. calcium channels as they are opening up and changing calcium levels from, remember that's in the ECF. Calcium is mainly in the ECF. Floods into the cell, acts as a chemical messenger. Here's our, what's that? What do you think that is? Endoplasmic reticulum, right? Endoplasmic reticulum attached to the nucleus. That's where we make proteins, right? That's what rough endoplasmic reticulum does. This is, when we talk about insulin and glucagon, these are water-soluble hormones. That means they're protein-based. Proteins are made in the rough endoplasmic reticulum. So what you see there is calcium says, hey, let's crank up the production of it. Oh, there's a gene that produces a protein, right? That's what genes do. This protein is insulin. So it activates this gene, which then we produce more proteins. We package them up in little granules like this, right? From the endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi apparatus, and then we release them into the extracellular fluid. Again, you don't have to know that, but we're like big picture just going, okay, this organ does this and releases that hormone, and that does that. This kind of shows you how these cells actually respond in terms of the cellular machinery to make these things in response to some sort of change in the internal environment. Okay, so again, you don't have to worry about that, but I just thought it was interesting in terms of the production of insulin and the regulation of glucose, etc. One other thing associated, of course, with insulin and glucose levels is diabetes. So there's a couple different types of diabetes, a few different types of diabetes, actually. This type of diabetes, diabetes mellitus, this one is related to problems in insulin levels. So we saw there's a lot of insulin producing beta cells in those pancreatic islets, but there can be problems in terms of that communication pathway, right? So we know that there is type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Technically, there's other types. There's like type 3 diabetes. You're like, what?
Is that about Alzheimer's?
Yeah.
I don't know enough about it, but I just heard that.
I don't know a ton about it either, but in this case, type 3 diabetes, I was just talking about it with a couple of other colleagues just recently, was reminding me about it. So type 3 diabetes has to do with insulin and glucose kind of storage and things like that in the brain instead, which makes sense, right? Those are really active cells there. They're going to be burning through glucose a lot. We need to make sure that those levels are appropriate. So T3 has to do with insulin receptors or receptivity, if you will, in the brain and how it may lead to Alzheimer's, where we are accumulating other types of plaques and things like that possibly, and the tissue is not functioning properly. So in any case, in these other more common ones that we know about, type 1 and type 2, it's problems with insulin. But in type 1, it's hyposecretion of insulin from the pancreatic islets, from those beta cells. So what's happening here is those beta cells are being targeted, and we are not producing enough of the insulin. So often it's an immune response, autoimmune response, where it's like, we're attacking our own cells. Now those cells can't produce insulin. Now the cells that are supposed to help regulate glucose levels can't. So that's why we see big spikes in glucose and then big drops in glucose, because we're not able to regulate it ourselves. And so people with type 1 diabetes, the cells in the muscle, in the liver, are just waiting for the message, but the message isn't coming because the insulin isn't being released, right? Because those beta cells are being destroyed. So what can happen is, if we're monitoring that externally then, if you have a glucose monitor, it's interesting to see how many of those, right? It's very convenient now to have that monitor. It used to be like a blood stick, and you'd have to test the glucose levels, like we saw in the multisex. You could test it in the urine too, because we know that excess glucose ends up there. But it's a little bit easier maybe to do in front of people if you're doing it in the finger, as opposed to peeing in front of them. Regardless, you used to have to do that a lot to monitor blood glucose levels. Now they have some of the automatic monitors. It's interesting to see how many of those are out there, right?
You can even get it if you're not diabetic. You can just
looking
order
at metabolism.
Amazon status and put it on there, and that way you can regulate for ketosis and stuff.
Right? So if you're doing metabolism and diet and stuff like that, right, you can really look at the metabolic effects of what you're taking in and how the body's processing. But it's interesting to see how many of them are out there. Right? For people that are diabetic, especially type 1 diabetes, you really don't have an idea that they have this disorder. But now it's a little bit more obvious because you see a lot of those monitoring devices. In any case, if they see their glucose levels going too high, what do? They're injecting insulin because their cells aren't making it. Now here's another small aside. I know we're kind of tapering off in terms of time. Where's all that insulin come from? Where's all that insulin come from that's in the injector pens? Are we harvesting that from some people in the middle of the night in Vegas and pulling their insulin?
It's synthesized, right?
Yes.
It's synthesized, right? So it has to be, remember these hormones have to match up with the receptors. So you can't just go and take like some other, like, oh, I'm going to go pull pig insulin per se, right? It may not be the same shape, just like plant carbohydrates aren't the same shape, so our enzymes don't work with them, right? So what happens is, this is like when you're talking about like gene editing, etc. So what they did is, it's a gene that makes insulin. What they do is they take a copy of that gene, they put it in bacteria, and now it's part of the bacterial DNA. So when the bacteria reproduces, it's very easy for bacteria to reproduce. Pathogenic one, we reproduce, they're producing all the time, we don't like that. These beneficial ones, put them in vats, nice and warm, give them nutrients, they reproduce like crazy. When they're reproducing, their metabolic reproduction from their DNA also then produces insulin, human insulin, that then we harvest as what they call humulin. It's made in bacteria, but it's human DNA that is creating this particular human insulin. We harvest it, that's what we then put back into us, right? They are producing it. What?
Like the actual name brand is Humulin.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I thought they were being cute.
So it's pretty interesting that bacteria are doing it. That's where it all comes from. And of course, then it's been really expensive for a time. There's a whole lot of that in the news about how expensive it is, and it shouldn't be, right? It takes a lot of time to develop those pathways and the research that goes into it. But once they have it, it's bacteria, right? It's just like big containers and just.
Well, and the guy who made insulin way back when, he
Right.
didn't put a patent on it because he wanted it to be accessible, and
Right.
now it's not.
Yeah. So there are changes in that. Those costs are coming down. The government's getting involved and stuff like that. But they've also developed new technologies. I was just reading recently that they were talking about there's research right now to try to get plants in the same kind of mechanism, get plants to make insulin instead, human insulin. Because then it's also very easy to grow plants. And when they're making it, then it's a little bit cheaper. Oh, here's the other thing. No, there's another one. This was really cool. I posted it on the board out there. I have articles out in the lobby out there, new articles on things. There was a group that got cows to make insulin, to produce insulin in their milk. So we know that these beta cells are found where? In the pancreatic islet. Right? That's the only place, and it's very small volume. So what if we just make a bunch of those cells that are then making a bunch of insulin? And so what they were able to do, again, kind of transgenic, pros and cons of that, they got cows, a certain strain, if you will, of cow. They made a bunch of embryos of cows. They grew them up. The ones that survived, they got them to, again, as a cow, start lactating and things like that. They got those beta cells to be established in mammary glands instead, right? So now, mammary glands, they produce a lot of material all the time, right? So now they're producing a lot of milk, and that milk has insulin in it. And that insulin can be harvested then, potentially from the milk, and there's your insulin source. And what they estimated is that if they can develop a herd of these cows, they actually estimated, now it's early in the process, right? They haven't done the extraction yet, and they haven't made a bunch of cows this way. They've made like one cow in South America. But if they can make enough of these cows, they think that to supply the United States with enough insulin that it needs for all of its diabetics that use insulin, they would need one herd of 100 cows, and it can handle all of the insulin needs of the United States.
But will it? Will they allow it to?
It's all kinds of things, right? Like, will it come to fruition? Who's going to own it? How much is it going to cost? And stuff like that. There's all kinds of aspects to it, but it was interesting developments. Okay, so in essence, we'll finish up the rest of this system as we get towards the end of it next time. We don't have much to go. We mentioned a little bit in terms of the gonads and the sex hormones, but we're really going to bring those in with reproductive system instead.
I only had one going, because I barely updated all the updates we need. Oh, yeah. I only made one graph.